one of the things I've been thinking about lately is to do with forests and woods and people who live in forests and woods. And I guess this is partly stimulated by reading about Heidegger, as I've been doing. I didn't really mean to read about his biography, but I ended up coming across that. And he spent a lot of time in the Black Forest, in a cabin, halfway up a hill in the Black Forest, and was very attached to that, and did most of his writing there, apparently. And for me, it's that forest that Heidegger is writing in, and the kind of writing he does there, and the kind of ideas he promulgates, for me it's kind of linked to other cabins in forests in which writers have done some work. And the one that immediately springs to mind is Henry David Thoreau's cabin at Walden Pond, in which he wrote Walden. And the third cabin in the forest, or the third cabin in the wilderness at least, is that one that Ted Kazinski, the Unabomber, squatted in when he made his little bombs and wrote his Unabomber manifesto. And it's, for me at least, there's some kind of similarities between these cabins and between these solitary men scribbling away in these cabins and the kind of things they're scribbling about. In a way, they're all, it seems to me, they're all kind of remaking versions of the noble savage myth. The noble savage myth that features in a poem by Dryden, but is expressed in other kinds of philosophies, notably Rousseau. But in Dryden's poem, if I remember rightly, it goes something like through. No, I can't get it. But it's something to do with innocence and running through a forest, and as a kind of noble savage. The idea being that, you know, before the collapse of innocence that modern civilization and technology represents, before an ability to conceptualize, a kind of pre-lapsarian state, mankind was, as this term implies, noble and innocent and free, and kind of naturally moral, I suppose, or naturally good at least. And those things have been corrupted by the onslaught of civilization. It's an unpopular idea and widely disproved, I would suggest. But I think that current certainly runs through Heidegger, Thoreau, and indeed Kazinski. Heidegger talks about this state of engagement, this idea that in order to live an authentic life, which he clearly regards as the only life worth living, one doesn't take a kind of spectator view on the world, one doesn't reflect, one doesn't engage in analysis and conceptualization. He says if you do that, that just turns the experience into a collection of things. And you become a kind of stamp collector for objects and experiences, sticking them into nice orders from a safe distance. Whereas he says engagement is the authentic way of being, in which one totally commits oneself and gives one's over to tasks, for example. And the examples he uses are all rural and bucolic tasks. So he talks about woodcutters chopping wood, and they don't break that task down into the parts of the axe and the nature of the wood they're cutting and the swing of their arm and any of those kind of things. It's a task, and it's unified, and all of the elements in it, to the extent that you can call them elements at all, including themselves, are completely synthesized within that task. And he says that's engagement and that's authentic. And wouldn't it be nice, he seems to be saying, if instead of being these over-civilized, over-technologically equipped, over-analytical, over-conceptual fallen beings, we could, go back to the Black Forest and be like woodsmen. He seems to be saying in that, and his flirtation with Nazi ideology was part of that, I think. Because certainly, as I understand it, early parts of German National Socialism in the 30s had a lot of that going on for him. A lot of kind of Wagnerian, Black Forest mythology before it got very sticky later on. So Heidegger certainly seems to me to be part of that. Thoreau also, I think, is part of that. I mentioned before in a previous video that very famous quotation of his from Walden, where he says that he moved to the woods because he wished to live deliberately. And I can't remember exactly how that quotation continues. That's from Walden, but it talks about living and not living. He doesn't want to get to the end of his life and think he's not lived. By which I'm interpreting, he doesn't want to get to the end of his life and think that he's lived inauthentically. He's been a kind of spectator on his own life. That he spent his life accumulating lists of objects and experiences in that kind of stamp collecting way I mentioned. But rather that he's actually lived. That he's been engaged with it. And his whole pursuit of going to this cabin by Walden Pond and kind of communing with nature to the extent that he did, I think there's some dispute as to what extent he actually did that, is absolutely part of that philosophy. It seems to be running through that. A deliberate attempt to reject a kind of reflective approach in favour of a more engaged approach. And he's also anti-technological. He was very against the development of railroads and one or two other things. He saw them as instruments of reflective conceptualization, if you like, that distance us from experience and make engagement with tasks more difficult, more distant. They force a spectatorship. And the third is Ted Kazinski, the Unabomber, who it's quite a few years ago now, but this is some guy who lived in a cabin in Montana, I think. But he sent various mail bombs, letter bombs, to a number of individuals. I can't remember who they were actually, but I think there were people like principals of universities, maybe CEOs of corporations.